Historical misconceptions we all believed. Are you sure you know history as well as you think? Here are some historical misconceptions we all once believed. Einstein flunked math. Stories have circulated that Albert Einstein flunked math. We all love the idea that even the great Einstein struggled, but that's not the truth. Einstein once failed the college entrance exam, but it wasn't because of the math section. Cars were invented in America. If someone asked you about the first car ever made, most of us bring up Henry Ford's Model T, which was first introduced in 1908. However, Nicholas Joseph Cugnot was the first person to create an actual vehicle in 1769. This car was steam-powered and was called the Cugnot Fardier. People only lived to 30 during the Middle Ages. It seems like death always loomed over the Middle Ages. However, the most dangerous period for someone in this era was infancy, and the mortality rate for babies was as high as 50%. Once people passed this period, they had a good chance of living to be 60. Nixon was an environmentalist. Nixon was far from an environmentalist, even if his signature did give us the EPA and the Safe Drinking Water Act. In reality, Nixon was doing what he could to keep supporters. At the time, both air and water were toxic, so he did what he could to fix it to get a higher approval rating. Salem burned witches at the stake. Between 1692 and 1693, almost 200 people were accused of witchcraft in Salem. Most were jailed, some were hanged, and one unlucky soul was crushed with heavy stones. Not a single one was burned. The forbidden fruit was an apple. The book of Genesis never mentions what kind of fruit Eve grabbed from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Biblical scholars think that it could be a fig since Adam and Eve were dressed in fig leaves, while some Muslim scholars claim it could have been wheat or grapes. George Washington had wooden teeth. Washington did have dentures, but they weren't made out of wood. The dentures in question were made from hippopotamus ivory, which stained easily and gave it a grain that looked like wood. Iron maidens were medieval torture devices. Medieval torture was gruesome, but Iron Maidens were completely made up. The first stories about them didn't pop up until the 18th century. Once started, the story spread as a way to encourage the idea that the Middle Ages were gruesome and violent. Betsy Ross sewed the first American flag. The only evidence we have that Betsy Ross designed and sewed the American flag is from her grandson. The real creator was probably Francis Hopkinson, who also signed the Declaration of Independence. He designed many seals for the United States government, so it isn't a jump to think he did the same for the American flag. Paul Revere shouted in the streets. The idea of Paul Revere riding through the streets yelling, "The British are coming," is certainly a great one, but it never happened. In the colonies, not everyone was cool with the idea of a revolution, so it was more of a whisper and was probably a coded phrase like, "The regulars are coming out." Napoleon was short. It's become a popular joke that Napoleon was short. It even spawned the phrase, Napoleon complex. In truth, he was 5 feet 7 inches. By today's standards, that may be short, but that height was pretty respectable in France when he was alive. Over time, we've just gotten taller. Cowboys wore cowboy hats. Cowboys on the American frontier had no real interest in wearing something as bulky as a cowboy hat. The most popular headgear worn by people in the 19th century, particularly by gunslingers, was a bowler or derby hat. Vikings wore horned helmets. Anytime we see a depiction of a Viking, they're usually wearing a horned helmet. It makes them look a little scarier, but it's all made up. There's no historical evidence for Vikings having horned helmets. Some historians aren't even sure that Vikings wore helmets at all. California is an island. This wasn't one that we ever believed here in America, but it's a pretty funny story. In the 16th century, an old map of California left it hanging off the side of the continent like an island. It was a long-held European misconception that was around for over 100 years. Alexander the Great had the largest empire in ancient history. The Mongolian Empire was easily the largest empire in ancient history, not Alexander's. That's precisely why so many people are related to Genghis Khan. That's also why China had such a hard time keeping the Mongols at bay. Shakespeare created Hamlet. Everyone knows the story of Hamlet, but Shakespeare didn't create it. He based it on another piece called The Life of Amleth, which was written by Saxo Grammaticus. Both stories were based on the Prince of Denmark. Both men went mad because of the hasty marriage to the killer, and both princes killed the usurper. AD means after death. Many people think that AD means after death. It's a good way to differentiate AD from BC, but it isn't correct. AD stands for Anno Domini, a Latin phrase actually means, in the year of the Lord. As for BC, that stands for before Christ. Columbus discovered America. First of all, Columbus wasn't the first person that sailed to America. That honor goes to Leif Erikson, a Viking who walked on North American soil approximately 500 years before Columbus. On top of that, Columbus never came to the later named nation of the United States of America. Instead, he landed on the Caribbean islands. Thomas Edison invented the light bulb. Edison had over 1,000 patents, but he didn't invent the light bulb. There were a lot of people playing around with the idea of electric light before Edison got his hands on the idea. What Edison really did was create the first light bulb that was practical and affordable. War of the Worlds caused mass hysteria. It's said that Orson Welles fooled the world in 1938 when he presented H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds on the radio. Allegedly, this broadcast caused mass hysteria because people thought the alien invasion was real. The mass hysteria claim is inflated, though. The only person that thought it was real was a single farmer. The Pilgrims invented Thanksgiving. Despite what we thought, the Pilgrims were not responsible for the Thanksgiving holiday. It wasn't until the Lincoln presidency that the United States began to observe the holiday annually, more than a century after the Pilgrims held their celebration. Manhattan was purchased for beads. This one is partially true. The misconception is that the island of Manhattan was purchased for around $24 worth of beads. History doesn't show what items were involved in the transaction, but it equaled 60 guilders. That would be roughly $1,000 today, and this was the same amount that was paid for Staten Island. Southerners feared kitchen fires. Some people claim that Southerners kept their kitchens detached because they were afraid of house fires. But the reality has to do with Southern weather. It gets incredibly hot down there. Kitchens also get super hot, which can heat the rest of the home as well. Everyone in the colonial era wore wigs. We know a colonial setting where everyone is wearing a wig, but only about 5% of the population wore wigs. During this time, wigs were costly and only worn by those that could afford them: lawyers, statesmen, and gentry women. Soldiers were spit on after returning home from Vietnam. People often point out that anti-war protesters spat on soldiers returning from Vietnam. Despite being a popular sentiment and featuring in TV and movies like Rambo, there doesn't appear to be a lot of convincing evidence that this was the case. Drinking was illegal during Prohibition. For more than a decade, alcohol prohibition was the law of the land in the United States, thanks to the ratification of the 18th Amendment to the Constitution. While this amendment did outlaw the production of most forms of alcohol in the country, it didn't actually prohibit the consumption of alcohol. Ronald Reagan was responsible for the fall of the Berlin Wall. When Americans think about the fall of the Berlin Wall, many of them remember then-President Ronald Reagan's famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." That makes it seem like Reagan played a pivotal role in the fall of the wall, but that's not actually true. He just happened to have a very catchy line. Bill Clinton was impeached for having an affair. People remember Clinton's impeachment and assume it was because of his affair with Monica Lewinsky, but the reality of Clinton's impeachment is a bit more complicated than that. He was actually impeached for lying about the affair under oath during the Whitewater scandal investigation. Lindbergh made the first transatlantic flight. When Charles Lindbergh took his first transatlantic flight between New York and Paris in 1927, it made headlines. It was the first time he'd done it, but the first one was completed in 1919 by two British aviators named Alcock and Brown. They flew non-stop from Newfoundland to Ireland. Medieval people spiced rotten meat to mask flavor. Medieval people weren't about to get a stomachache every time they wanted some protein. Plus, spices were much too expensive to put on rotting meat that would still get you sick. Spices were only used to embellish high-quality food. Find more at alot.com.